Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a real pleasure joining you today, and I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to discuss how at UN Women we are working to improve data collection and reliability of statistics and indicators on gender and intersectionality. In particular, I would like to talk to you about what I would say has been an evolution in UN Women with a series of products and activities in recent years that are helping to shape our knowledge and approach. But before I delve into that, let's first talk about the present. It is an understatement to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has pretty much upended everything and affected everyone. But it is also fair to say that everyone isn't affected quite the same way. From the data that we have, we know that men have higher mortality rates. But every other metric points to women essentially bearing the brunt of the crisis. Women are shouldering the burden of increased and intense workloads at home. New data that we just published earlier this month shows that poverty differentials by sex are going to widen between now and 2030 as a result of this pandemic. And adding insult to injury, women's lives are literally in danger at home because of the scourge of domestic violence. Sadly, when crises hit, we tend to see similar patterns. The reason is that disasters do not happen in a vacuum. They intersect with and tend to exacerbate existing inequalities. We know that COVID-19 sadly worsens the outcomes of people with pre-existing conditions. But gender inequality is, in effect, society's pre-existing condition. So we are seeing these consequences play out in real time. Why is this relevant? For policy responses, we need to understand these pre-existing conditions and how the pandemic feeds on them. And adequate gender statistics are critical for that. However, prior to the pandemic, we only had 31% of the data needed to monitor the SDGs. Although we have worked hard to ensure that all 14 gender-related SDGs indicators can now be measured, only 45% of the data needed to measure violence against women and girls is available. The picture is even worse when we start disaggregating by specific characteristics such as age, disability, migrant status, and so forth. With these acute data gaps, not only do we have challenges predicting the impact of the pandemic, we are also extremely concerned that the response will leave out these important issues and continue to leave the most vulnerable women and girls behind. We at UN Women recognize the challenge of lack of data early, and as part of our efforts to monitor the SDGs, we started a large global program called Women Count to improve the planning, production, and use of gender statistics globally. And one thing that we've paid particular attention to is how to address gender and intersectionality and ensure that this is a default approach rather than an afterthought, as is often the case. So I would just like to start by discussing a report that we produced in 2018. The report is named Turning Promises into Actions, Gender Equality in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Chapter 4 of the report focused on intersecting forms of discrimination and cluster deprivations. And what you see on your screen here is just looking at some of the approach that we use, at least in the disaggregation of data, to show how different forms of discrimination intersect. We looked at several countries as case studies, and just by using data, we were able to show how the same groups tend to suffer from deprivations across several dimensions. Just taking the case of Nigeria, for instance, 99% of Fulani women and girls living in the poorest rural households failed to complete more than 6 years of education. They are 18 times as likely to be education poor as Igbo women living in the richest urban households. And across other SDGs, and this is the picture that you see on the right, we also see that the same group of Fulani women are those that are deprived across almost all other SDGs indicators that we looked at. And so this is what we call compound deprivations, and they are also common in developed countries, which underlines, I think, the relevance of this agenda to all countries. In the United States, for instance, a Hispanic woman from a low-income household is 13 times as likely to lack a high school diploma, twice as likely to be out of work, and 10 times as likely to lack health insurance as a white woman from a higher income household. This exercise clearly demonstrated the value of disaggregating existing data. And building on this report, last February, we organized the Counted and Visible Global Conference on gender and intersecting inequalities. We had 2 very rich days of provocative discussions with some overall strong key messages that came out of it. And just to share some of those with you, first, I think one of the key points that came out was that we need to pay closer attention to the meaning of gender inequality and really striving beyond just the same treatment for women and men, as for women and men. We need a strong conceptual framework that is really grounded in human rights. We also need an enabling legal framework supporting the production and dissemination of disaggregated data in order to ensure that no one is left behind, with commitments, particularly from governments, to favor an enabling environment, including through laws and regulations. Data governance is about fundamental issues of power, money, and control. And this was, I think, a key point that came up several times during the discussions. And so we must ask who gets to decide, who benefits, and if harm is being done to anyone, without exception. We must work within the framework of nothing about us without us. And this is particularly important considering the intersecting inequalities and how class and other categories shape our lives and the technologies that we engage with today. A clear takeaway was that business as usual will not stop women and girls from being left behind in the production and use of data. Leave no one behind analysis should begin with examining national policies and strategies to identify priorities. And if the data is incomplete, often we see that policy responses will also be incomplete. Therefore, it is essential to expand surveys and other data collection methods to ensure that what needs to be measured gets measured. We need greater collaboration between national statistical systems and non-state agents, including civil society organizations, the private sector, international organizations, feminist activists, and so on, really to ensure that all of the voices are accounted for in the process of data production and use. What we found is that the political will is often lacking in identifying those who are most often left behind, because data, after all, is political as well. So national statistical systems need to have a clear and objective voice to be able to have at least all groups represented, and including those who are likely to be left behind. And generally, those voices really are coming from civil society, so including them in the process is important. We should ask what data and for who. For example, data on specific groups of women with disabilities or data on specific groups of women or women with disabilities is often inaccessible to those women because of lack of funds allocated to translation or interpretation, captioning, and etc. And clearly that is important to account for. The conference showcased several examples where collaboration between users and producers at early stages of data collection resulted in really important outcomes. And this happens usually, we have examples from Colombia, from Georgia, and Kenya, and this happened through co-creation. And so between users and producers at early stages of data collection, analysis, and use. So it was really important. It is really important to ensure that all groups are represented and so that ownership is increased. We spent a long time discussing the role of non-official statistics. Concerns over the use of non-official data, as you know, may emerge in part because new data sources challenge the traditional political economy of data production and use. And the fact that we are bringing, this brings new stakeholders to the table can be perceived as a threat, or at least it is uncharted territory in some quarters. But we also know that official data can adhere to statistical standards, but be discriminatory at the same time. So the question is not if, but how official statistics can be harnessed to work alongside non-official statistics can be harnessed to work alongside official statistics to improve SDGs monitoring. In other words, we need to reshuffle the top-down power dynamics in data generation and use. I think finally, having the right tools and guidelines is important. And I think that was some of the main conclusions of the conference. However, we are also faced with a cold reality. None of this happens without resources, both technical and financial. Although investments in gender statistics have increased slightly in recent years, it has stayed largely flat over the past decade as a small percentage of official development assistance source statistics. A recent analysis by Paris 21 shows that only 11% of total budgets for COVID-19 related data projects include specific gender dimensions. So we shouldn't at all be surprised about the lack of gender statistics to monitor the SDGs, or how we fail to have the data to understand the full effects of the pandemic on women and girls. We urgently essentially need to reverse this picture for a more effective response. So what's next about after the conference? The work that we've been doing at UN Women recently builds on all of this, with a focus on filling data gaps and providing proven tools and resources that can be easily adapted by countries to monitor gender and intersecting inequalities. And for instance, just to share with you some recent work that we've done. So for instance, to address the COVID-19 crisis, with partners, we've worked to conduct over 30 rapid assessment gender surveys between March and now, providing critical information to policymakers on the socio-economic impact of the crisis. And some of the dashboards that we've been producing are also helping to fill this gap. And finally, in terms of tools, building on the Counted and Visible conference, we are continuing an open discussions with several post-conference blogs that have been published on the Women Count Data Hub. And we're also working on a project to build a toolkit on better utilizing existing household surveys to produce more disaggregated gender statistics. The toolkit benefited immensely from the conference and is currently being piloted in 7 countries, namely in Albania, Cameroon, Georgia, Mongolia, Senegal, Tanzania, and Vietnam. The toolkit should be ready by early next year, so please watch this space. And just to finish by saying that if you are interested in any of the materials that that was presented during the conference, you can access it at data.unwomen.org. Data.unwomen.org, and I really thank you for your attention. Thank you.